We started out looking for a story about how looking at PDVSA helps you understand how Venezuela has fallen apart over the last couple of years. But we found ourselves with him and found ourselves completely We started out looking for a story about how looking at PDVSA helps you understand how Venezuela has fallen apart over the last couple of years. But we found ourselves with him and found ourselves completely fascinated by his world. And what's so he has become a kind of broker, bringing people who want to give testimony or who feel they have no choice but to give testimony to U.S. officials who are pursuing cases of corruption and drug trafficking.
I feel like he's thick in the middle of it. Take a step back, because he was a low-level employee, right? Low-level-ish at the IMF. How did he come to be kind of at the epicenter of all that's kind of bad, or much of what's bad, in Venezuela?
Right. So he was, as you said, he'd actually come here as a young graduate from university to study English and to sort of expand his horizons a little bit. From Venezuela. He's Venezuelan. And he came here in 2000. And he started working, and he met a guy at a party who's an Israeli guy who went to work for a consulting firm that was hired by a big bank that was worried that money coming through a bank they wanted to buy in Panama had Iranian money coming through it, which would violate U.S. sanctions against Iran.
So basically then from there, he became sort of a freelancer, found that he kind of had a knack for looking into these things.
Exactly.
Where then did his business start to prosper? Who started giving him contracts?
So to just take one step back, what happened is that he had been an intern for several months at PDVSA at the oil company before coming to America. And when this guy called him and said, we're looking into whether PDVSA is involved in Iranian money coming through Panama American Bank, he called a friend of his at PDVSA, and it all sort of opened up a whole bunch of documents, and he worked the story. And basically, it was partly out of patriotism. He wasn't making any money out of it. But then ultimately, he realized that U.S. agencies would pay him to bring these folks, and he could act as a sort of intermediary, helping the people who wanted to talk cut a deal with U.S. agencies, and the agencies paid him. And then those folks some of them were wealthy, were willing to pay him to help get them out. And ultimately, he also went to work as a kind of consultant for big banks and hedge funds.
Ethan, what's interesting is you actually say he brought something like 24 elites from Venezuela to the United States to kind of tell about what was going wrong in Venezuela, and specifically with their giant oil company. You're talking about former generals. You're talking, I think,
that's
about
right. Even
former
ministers.
Yeah.
Absolutely. These are very serious people who, some of them had been involved or seen bad stuff. Some of them were suddenly being pursued by the regime in Venezuela. And Martin became a guy they knew who had links to U.S. agencies and became their intermediary. And he also has a very charming manner. And he has he also, when he sits you down, often they would meet at a Caribbean island, and he would download what you knew as someone who wanted to get information out, and then he would figure out where it could go, and he ended up being this amazing intermediary.
You guys met him?
Oh, I spent many hours with him.
And what's he like?
He's a very interesting guy, because this world we're describing, that we're talking about, feels kind of almost a demi-monde or underworld, but Martin is very charming, and I think he's both sort of a bulldozer and a pussycat at the same time. He's a guy who can get his way, but who also, he sort of moves you through his sincerity. You don't have the feeling that he's out to screw you, to be perfectly honest. You have the feeling that he wants to move this thing along. And part of it is he really is very upset at what has happened to Venezuela, and he wants to have the government be moved out.